Okay, so where are we at? Here are our boards, very thin, reasonably cleaned of material. That's certainly good enough to put the vellum on. We have these, a number of loose fly pages. These are much more modern paper, so probably not going to put these back in the book. I'll probably use something a little bit more sympathetic, because there's a very big difference in paper, as you can see, between this modern paper and the actual text block itself, the original. The text block, one of the challenges I think that's going to be most difficult here, is just how vulnerable the text block is. So if I zoom close in, what we can see is this sort of rip is almost impossible to really mend. Almost impossible. Obviously these pages are printed on both sides, so it's very difficult to actually put a piece of even contemporary paper on there without sort of hiding more text. It's the big problem as well with trying to mend a page like this is the weight of whatever you put on here, because the whole page is very vulnerable. And the one thing it's not going to be able to take is, if I just zoom out a little bit, if I put any kind of repair on here, that's extra weight that now the page up here at the top needs to bear, which means you're starting to risk the page, eventually becoming detached or just ripping somewhere else, because now you've put extra mass on it that it's just not in a position to sustain. So that's going to be tough. Fortunately, it's only this first page of the preface, which is obviously one of the most important parts of the book, but it's probably going to be difficult to actually even if I were to put a piece of contemporary paper here and literally use a bit of manuscript, literally clear, just write in the missing text. I'd still be hiding text where it's adhered. I don't want to use any kind of modern tape or anything like that on it. So I'm kind of a bit flummoxed about how to actually just mend this little bit. Maybe it can't be mended. Maybe it just has to stay like that, and we just need to be very careful to make sure that that page isn't damaged further, clearly. So what I've done, and I wanted just to illustrate here, so as is the case with many smaller books, instead of having a raised band, what you actually have is a trench, in effect, that's dug into the text block, with the threads actually just going directly across the top of the trench, as it were. So I don't think, unfortunately, I can zoom or render this any more accurately, but you can probably just about see there, I've actually got this thread going underneath the original binding threads. And obviously I've had to replace there. So an original hemp band that went across there. So literally I was picking away with a needle to get rid of the original hemp. And then eventually, once I'd gotten rid of that, I was able to thread this string through. Now, the actual threading of the string is not that easy, and I wanted just to demonstrate a method that I've come up with for doing it, because a needle and thread doesn't work, at least not for me, and here's why. If you look at the construction of a needle, the problem you have is the eye of the needle is double the width of the rest of the needle. So you can't put this point through any kind of hole and expect that you can thread a piece of thread of that diameter through the same hole. You can't. Because through the eye, you've got double the width of metal in one plane And in the other plane, 90 degrees, you're going to have double the thickness of the thread. So you end up with just a much greater diameter here than the diameter of the needle, which just means you end up only able to put through very, threads that are much, much thinner than you, in theory, you should be able to put through. So the method I've come up with to get around this problem, which I think I did demonstrate on one of the very, very first book restoration videos I did. It was probably very amateurish, but to be honest, it's since served me well. And that is to actually make a needle out of the thread. And how I do that, first I want a really straight piece of thread. So I'm actually going to cut that there because I don't want that sort of bend. So there we go, that's pretty straight. What I'm then going to do is I'm going to put liquid, not gel, liquid cyanocrylate super glue on it. Like so. And what's going to happen, this is really important to use the liquid, not the gel, because you want the actual super glue to soak into the fibers. Get that back in shot. To soak into the fibers, so you can see this, the color change there like that. So that's enough. And then this is the bit that you just have to be slightly careful with. What I'm now going to do is tighten the thread to make it even narrower. And to do that, there's no other way other than to grab the end while it's still wet and give it a twist. And yes, your fingers will stick to it. But after just a few seconds, you can see the glue dries. And now this has become hard. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some scissors, and you can see the end of the needle that I've fashioned here is a little bit flattened. What I'm going to do is just trim it to a point. Like that. Yeah. Now that will actually go through a hole that's the diameter of the thread and fill basically the hole that you're trying to fill. So that is how I actually got these guys to go through. I must admit, I broke one or two, but you can see the actual principle. This sort of goes underneath. Now I'm going to be putting a piece of fabric across here with a heavy dose of school glue. So that's going to stabilize everything, and this will become really strong. But that's a method, and it's very amateurish, I guess, but it does work. And the result is a needle that is the thread. So overnight, I glued on the fabric and let it dry. So we've got the little sort of bands underneath there. So this is now, from a text block standpoint, this is now in a good robust state, and it's ready for board reattachment. So one thing I'm going to be doing shortly is just poking a hole for each band to just basically come through. And then we'll be in a position to think about board reattachment. And you can imagine there are going to be some little holes here that'll just feed these through. The fabric itself will be glued on as well, and that'll be fine. So starting to think forward to the vellum. The slight concern I have is how translucent. This is a very thin vellum. And to give you an idea, just bring the light over here, tilt this up a little bit. Oops. So the issue we have is just how translucent the vellum is. Now, I'm planning to do double thickness, so I'm going to be folding it over. even then it's still quite translucent. So I think what that means is, given how dark these boards are, I'm going to have to whiten the boards a little bit just to help stop it, you know, sort of appearing dull once the vellum's on. So the way I'm going to do that, I need to be really careful about the weight of anything that I add to these boards. These are incredibly light and thin. I want to keep them that way. So I'm not going to put sort of I'm not going to use physical paint. I'm also not going to put a sort of thick, heavy, sort of high grammage piece of paper on here. So what I need is something that's very good opacity, so not translucent, but at the same token extremely light, that I can just put underneath. And bizarrely, cash register paper ticks all of that. It's an extremely thin paper, but also very opaque. And this just happens to be exactly the right dimension. So what I'm going to be doing is gluing on one sheet of this. It'll make absolutely no difference really to the weight. And what that'll enable is when we put on the vellum, 2 layers of, it's going to look really quite pale. It'll look very similar to how we'd want, how we'd want it to look really. So that's going to be a step there I do before we get onto the really interesting bit, which is actually trying to put the vellum on. The other thing as well, just to mention, is I do want to, although I don't particularly want vellum ties to show through sort of up along here, there's really no need, it's a very, very small book. I do think it would be appropriate, in keeping with the time, to actually have corner vellum ties angled like this. So I'm not going to use this, it's way too dark, but I'm going to use a strip of vellum just to put a sort of a faux tie in at the corners. It's actually not going to be part of the structure of the spine, but it's literally, you'll see a little sort of loop of vellum here, one here. It'll be hidden underneath, and then the same on the back. So I think that'll look very nice. So first thing to do is reattach the boards. That'll be very quick and easy. Put this paper on, and then we'll be in a position to move ahead with the vellum. Okay, so the boards are reattached, like so. As you can see here, I've just put one sheet of that sort of paper on, just a very light, just sort of gluing. I don't want to slather this on. So it literally just goes, this doesn't need to be particularly sophisticated, it's really just enough just to take the worst of the brownness away. It also has the advantage of just smoothing down the cord that we loop through, and it even just stabilizes the edge of the board a little bit there as well, and there was a little bit of damage just along this edge. So there we go. So the next step's going to be, I'll glue the fabric up like that. That'll complete the board reattachment there. I'm going to put a little bit of thin card, or even paper, frankly, just glue over, maybe just white paper again, just to glue over this, just so I keep the glue that's going to be on the vellum separate from this fabric. And then we'll attempt to do the vellum. Okay, so here is where we're at now. I've got the sheet on both sides. Internally it's glued, so I've just got obviously some protective toweling here just to make sure that we don't get any glue in the text block. And on the outside I've used a piece of slightly more robust, heavier contemporary paper. This is from the same time period. So that's going there. So I'm just going to wait now a little bit until the fabric internally glues, But basically this is now ready to attempt the attachment of the vellum. So this was our vellum sheet. As you can see, it still has some of the printing on, which frankly I think is kind of nice. It'll sort of give a hint at this vellum having a prior life before being used on the book, which of course is a completely normal thing for use of vellum in book binding. Now, we need to bear in mind vellum's not leather, and we've learned a lot about how it behaves differently. In particular, it sort of shrinks and stretches in a different way when it's wet. And the one thing we haven't tested is how it reacts to the glue. Now, because this is fundamentally skin, just like leather is, one thing I'm probably going to do is to treat this with leather consolidant, which is basically just propanol with a bit of polymer in it. And what that will do is hopefully stop glue from actually causing a permanent sort of blotching or darkening on the vellum, because it'll create a barrier that stops the glue from actually penetrating into the vellum. You just want the glue to be on the surface to actually do the adhesion, basically. So I'm going to do that. Fingers crossed that's not going to cause any unusual developments. And then once that's done and it's dried off, we'll be in a position to wet this. I want to try and stretch it a little bit because I kind of cut it a little too fine. It's just about going to be big enough to go over the boards, but really not by very much. So let me see if I can just get a little bit of stretching out of it. And then when we actually go for the adhesion, we're going to have to put this under quite a lot of tension just to make sure it stays flat. And the one thing I don't want is for it to sort of wrinkle in any great way as it dries. So I'm going to probably be using quite a lot of weight on this, together with a lot of toweling to sort of soak up the moisture as it dries. And we'll be doing it twice, obviously, because I want to do this as a double thickness. And then that'll result in hopefully a really good patina and a good finish. So that's really the plan. So we'll let this dry, and in the meantime I'll give this a little experiment with leather consolidant.